Thank you, Mary Kate. Welcome, everyone. My name is Jennifer Landheis, and I am the director of the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center. And I want to start off by thanking you all. I know you all have very busy days, and so I appreciate the fact that you are tuning into the webinar this afternoon. I'd also like to introduce my colleague Emma McDonald, who is going to help with the chat today. Oftentimes, as we are having these discussions and talking about options for survivors and accountability for offenders, there's things that come up that we want to link in the chat for you as far as resources, etc. So Emma's going to be helping us out in the chat. So big thank you to Emma. If you are not familiar with SPARC, we are funded by the Office on Violence Against Women to be a training and technical assistance provider. So we provide both virtual trainings like you're seeing today, as well as in-person trainings. And we also assist with what they call technical assistance. So if you're new to the OVW world and you're trying to still figure out like, what exactly does that mean? SPARC can help with things like helping you develop policies. If we inspire you today to start a coordinated community response in your jurisdiction regarding stalking, we can help you figure out what does that look like? How do we get it started? We're here to discuss particular case scenarios with you. If you want to call and pick our brains about certain case that you're working on and gain some additional insight, or find someone else across the country who might be able to lend you additional insight, please feel free to reach out to us. All of our contact information is available on our website, and that website is stalkingawareness.org. And I want to point out a couple of things that will be particularly helpful for those of you that are tuning in to today's webinar. And while I'm doing that, I would love to see in the chat from all of you if you have attended a SPARC webinar before. So yes, if you've attended a SPARC webinar, and no, if this is your first opportunity to be on a SPARC webinar. If you put that in the chat, that'll help me know a little bit about the training that you've had. It looks like we're getting a good mix. Several folks saying first opportunity. I thank you for appreciate that you phrased it that way. Several of you saying, yeah, we've had some opportunity to attend some previous stalking training by SPARC. Others of you that are saying, no, this is our first opportunity. This whole webinar kind of came about in working with OVW and the Improving Criminal Justice Response team, in that many people who are receiving ICJR funds are looking at improving their response to stalking. So we're offering a series of 3 webinars this week, next week, and the following week. This week we're covering the coordinated response. Next week we're going to be talking about the use of technology in stalking cases. And then the final week, we're going to talk about a little bit more in-depth on the investigation and prosecution side of stalking. So welcome to all of you for the first time. For those of you that have joined us before, welcome back. We appreciate it. The things that I want to point out to you on the website that I think will be helpful as we move throughout our time today is, first of all, what we call our practitioner guides. So we have guides for prosecutors. So for those of you that are prosecutors or working in a prosecution office, there's a guide to prosecuting stalking crimes. There are also guides for law enforcement on how to investigate stalking crimes, some checklists about things to look for, both in crimes that come in labeled as stalking, but also in crimes that we didn't identify stalking right away, and could assist us in identifying that stalking behavior within those particular crimes. We also have guides for advocacy folks, for corrections folks, etc. And Emma is already doing a fantastic job, and they are linking all those resources in the chat for all of you. So we'd encourage you to spend some time checking out the website. Everything that you find on the website is free for you to download, to use, to adapt in the work that you're doing with survivors and with offenders. So please feel free to use anything on there. You don't have to ask for our permission. You can just download it and begin to use it. The other thing that I want to point out is, if those of you that are blessed with the opportunity to do community education in your community, I've done domestic violence training and you've done stalking training, and you're thinking, perhaps we should also do some community awareness training on stalking. We have training modules on our website, both for community and public awareness opportunities, as well as training within your criminal justice world, or civil justice world, or advocacy world. And on those training modules, they have the PowerPoint slides, a script of what to say, videos that are already embedded in the PowerPoint. So don't frantically Google stalking training the night before you have to do it. You're free to use all of the resources that are on our website. And then the last thing that I would point out, but certainly not least, Spark does not work with victims directly. Our charge is to help all of you who are working with stalking victims. So please don't refer victims to our office. We will instruct them to get a hold of the agency that's closest to them to reach out for services. And in doing such, we also have some information on our website that is specifically tailored for victims about safety planning, some resources and materials. So for those of you that are working with victims, you can use those materials in your work with victims, so to enhance your safety planning, etc. So please feel free to look at those. And I would point out to you that most of our resources are available in both English as well as Spanish. So, and if you want to sign up for a newsletter, we announce in our newsletter when we have upcoming webinars, when we have upcoming training opportunities, when we've released new products, new information that will be helpful to you in your work with survivors. So please sign up for our newsletter. We won't spam your inbox, I promise, but it will be helpful to access some of the material in there. And we'll point out to you that there's certain opportunities coming forward. So certainly check that out. So we're going to start off our time together talking a little bit about what is it do we mean when we say we want to improve our coordinated response to stalking. And certainly we could use the legal definition of stalking, but because many of you are from various states across the country, that's not going to be super productive because all of the laws on stalking across the US vary greatly. They have different definitions, they have different punishments assigned to those stalking crimes. And so what we're going to instead do today is kind of ground our work in what we call the behavioral definition of stalking. And for most of you, that's going to sound familiar because it's probably echoed in your state statute. And we say that stalking is a pattern of behavior that's directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to either fear for their safety or the safety of somebody else, or suffer substantial emotional distress. I'm curious if any of you on the call, if you'll indicate in the chat, if you're also working with campus communities. If you have a campus in your jurisdiction, you're coordinating with your local campus to address stalking issues, I would love to know that in the chat. Because if you are, this definition will probably sound pretty familiar to you because it's also the definition that's included in our Clery Act reporting and from the Department of Education. So for those of you that are having that opportunity to work with campuses, it will sound pretty familiar to you. One of the things that I want to point out, though, as we look at this particular definition, is the thing that makes stalking crimes kind of difficult when it comes to our coordinated response. And that's the fact that we are looking at a pattern of behavior. And one of the things that we know is oftentimes in the criminal justice response to violence against women crimes, we're oftentimes looking at a singular incident, even in domestic violence cases. Law enforcement's often called out for a particular incident. Survivors might come in to a victim services place because of a particular incident that happened. They might be seeking a civil protection order. And what happens in stalking crimes is when we take that approach of that, looking at that single incident that has happened, we oftentimes miss the bigger picture. And in stalking crimes, analyzing the bigger pattern of behavior, or what might be referred to in your state statute as the course of conduct, is really important. And it kind of means that we're changing our approach to these particular crimes because we are looking to go from that incident-based response to looking at the bigger picture. And the reason that that's difficult is that many of us are stretched very thin for time, for resources, for the ability to be able to devote extra resources or time to those particular cases. And so when we're trying to coordinate a response to stalking, oftentimes we all have one particular piece of information. So we may have a survivor who's reached out to a victim advocacy agency. We might have law enforcement who has a little bit more information on the case or different information on the case, depending if the survivor has reached out to make a report to law enforcement. We might have corrections involved because we might have an offender or even a survivor who's on probation. And when we're looking at building these particular cases, we're oftentimes trying to put all of those individual pieces of the puzzle together to get the bigger picture of what's happening. And that makes it difficult. It can be really hard in stalking crimes to put all those pieces of the puzzle together not only because we all hold different pieces of information, but also because we are essentially relying on victims to put those pieces of the puzzle together for us. And so we're going to talk about some of the ways that as a coordinated community response, we can help put that puzzle together, using the information that victims are able to supply to us, but also using the resources and the work that we have done on other coordinated responses. So I'm curious in the chat if any of you have already a coordinated response to either domestic violence or sexual assault. Will you indicate that in the chat for me? And if it's to both, let me know that as well. And then if anyone already has a coordinated response to stalking, will you let me know that in the chat as well? That's super helpful for me to know. So as we look at their definition, when we look at that pattern of behavior, we are also considering the fact that victims oftentimes experience a variety of emotions. And sometimes they are articulating fear. Sometimes they are articulating frustration. Sometimes they're fed up with the system. They're feeling like there's no responsibility that's assigned to the offender. And so oftentimes when we are looking at these particular crimes, the definition is relying on the fact that it says a reasonable person in the victim's situation would experience either emotional distress or fear. But even for that, it can be difficult because we know oftentimes that fear is masked by emotions like anger, frustration, apathy, etc. And so when we're working on stalking crimes, trying to prove that the particular behavior that has happened has a certain impact on the victim who's reporting the crime or who has reached out to us for services is often one of the big hurdles that we have to jump through in addressing these particular crimes. And I see many of you are indicating in the chat that you have some kind of coordinated response for domestic violence and sexual assault. And I'm not surprised to see that many of you don't have a coordinated response to stalking. And some of you might say, well, we absolutely have that coordinated response. It's just within the context of domestic violence, or we cover those particular cases within our response to sexual assault. And we're going to talk about the benefits and maybe detriments of doing that as we go forward. The other thing that we want to think about in stalking crimes is when we are trying to prove that the behavior on the part of the offender has produced some kind of emotional distress or fear in the victim. One of the things that we have to keep in mind is the context of that particular relationship, of those behaviors, is really critical to understanding the case. So let me give you an example. Sometimes we see that there are behaviors that happen that might seem frightening to a victim that aren't frightening to those of us as a responder. So say, for instance, the victim receives flowers at work and reports this to law enforcement or someone else. And most of us on the outside are looking at that gift of flowers saying, I don't understand why that's fear-inducing. I don't understand why that could be frightening to a victim unless we understand the context behind it. The other thing that we have to figure out is sometimes because of the relationship between the victim and the offender or previous behaviors that have happened, there's behaviors that happen that have a specific meaning to the victim because of that relationship that don't necessarily mean things to the rest of us. And then perhaps the hardest piece of all of this is that in stalking crimes, we are essentially criminalizing non-criminal behavior. It is not criminal to send someone a text message, and it's not criminal to drive down a public street. Now, there's somebody who's probably saying, well, if there's a civil protection order in place, absolutely. But those behaviors in and of themselves are not crimes. But when we're putting those pieces of the puzzle together, we suddenly might have crimes that are happening, the crime of stalking, when we put the pieces of the puzzle together. But the individual incidents in and of themselves are oftentimes not criminal. So we might have a victim who comes forward to report to the criminal justice system, or even reaches out to victim advocacy folks who, those of us as responders might say, well, there's not really much we can do right now because it's not really a crime to show up at a baseball game, or it's not a crime to tell somebody that you love them and you miss them after they break up with you. So thinking about those things also impacts the fact that survivors have heard this from responders. They've been told this by folks. And so when they come forward to report stalking crimes, if they decide to come forward, they're often reluctant to come forward because they've been told that it was not a big deal, that there's nothing that can happen right now. Some of you might have heard from survivors who have said things to you before, like, do I have to wait until this person hurts me before anybody will do anything? And so one of the things that we need to keep in mind when we're working on stalking crimes is that entirety of the situation, that full context, is really important to understanding not only the impact on the victim, but how we hold the offenders in these particular situations accountable. So let me give you an example. This is a police report taken from a local jurisdiction. We didn't change anything about it, where the victim says, and they contacted law enforcement because this morning they went out to get in their locked vehicle, and inside of their locked vehicle on the car seat was a Corona beer bottle cap, and they called the police because of that. Now, I want you to think about the law enforcement response in your jurisdiction, and this is not to pick on law enforcement, but to think about their response in your jurisdiction. If somebody called and said there was a Corona beer bottle cap that was left on the inside of my locked car, what would the response be like in your jurisdiction? Would that be a lights and sirens response where law enforcement is going out and absolutely investigating it, and we're launching a full-scale investigation into what is happening? Would they just make a telephone contact with a victim? Would they even go out and take a report? If a report was taken, how much time is spent on something like this? So think about the response in your jurisdiction and what might happen. And in this particular jurisdiction, someone did go out and take a report, and they made contact with the victim. This was the call that came into dispatch, but what the officer found out when they were able to make contact with the victim was a lot more information. And the victim goes on to say that yesterday, she celebrated her 2-year anniversary of being sober, and she had gotten messages from people in her AA group congratulating her on her anniversary of sobriety. And she believes that the suspect in this particular case placed the beer bottle cap inside of her locked vehicle because seeing anything related to alcohol is a trigger for her. And she believes that the suspect has been monitoring her messages because that's the only way the suspect would have known about the anniversary of her sobriety. Now think about this particular case. What kind of questions do you think law enforcement had in responding to a case like this? If you're a prosecutor, what kind of questions are you hoping the law enforcement responded and asked? If you're a victim advocate, what are you hoping they determined? I'd love to see some of your responses in the chat. What are you curious about? What questions do you have? What kind of questions do you think or hope that law enforcement would have asked in a case like this? Anybody want to be brave and volunteer some information in the chat? Yeah, so someone said, Kayla said past relationship. So it says suspect, but what kind of relationship have they had with a suspect? Is this an intimate partner? Is it a stranger? Somebody said, does someone have a spare key to the vehicle, or has the suspect broken into the vehicle in the past? What does that look like? I appreciate that Sherry said, I want to know what the victim's feelings and reactions were to seeing that. And Sherry, I love that you pointed that out, because that's one of the things that often gets missed when we go through this particular scenario in training. Oftentimes people want to know that history, they want to know their relationship, they want to know why the victim believes this. But oftentimes we fail to ask the victim, what did you think was going to happen? What did that mean to you? And in state statutes across the country, we have to prove that victims felt fear or some kind of emotional distress as a result of the offender's actions. And if we never asked, what did you think was going to happen? What were you worried? What did that mean to you? Then we're missing one of the key elements that's often required in a stalking crime. I appreciate that someone else, somebody said it's because Sherry rocks. So Maggie and Sherry must know one another. The other things that I want to point out, somebody said, are you aware of anyone who knows your login information to see your messages? A lot of us, when we read this and it said, is monitoring her messages, most of us probably thought, oh, the suspect is monitoring the victim's text messages. Unless you're somebody under 30 and you're probably thinking, are they monitoring Snapchat messages? Is it an Instagram direct message? Is it a Facebook message? What kind of messages? Why do we think the offender might have access? Somebody also wanted to point out, is this a relationship where the victim has recently left the situation? And Kayla's alluding to the fact that we know that individuals who are leaving perhaps a domestic violence relationship are at increased risk of lethality during that time of separation. I would also add to that, that if this is an intimate partner situation, the fact that the offender is stalking the victim also contributes to the potential lethality in this situation. Anything else that you all want to know going forward? There's a lot, right? Yeah. So somebody said, does the offender have access to the victim's housing since they were able to place the beer bottle cap in the car? Is this a gated community? Is parking in the parking garage? Is the car sitting in front of the victim's house? Is the offender also monitoring the victim's home? Lots of questions about that, right? So keep in mind that oftentimes this is a very tiny little snippet of what's going to be embarked upon when we're investigating a case like this. And what happens a lot of times is when we get something just like this and we're investigating it as part of a stalking crime, many times we don't have probable cause to move forward. We don't have the time or resources. What happens in a lot of cases like this is no one even goes and talks to the alleged suspect. The report's just taken from the victim. It's written up as a potential property crime, and it's never identified as part of a course of conduct in a stalking crime until the next incident happens, or the next, or the next. And oftentimes what happens is victims of stalking have reached out when things like this happen, and they may not have received the response that they were looking for from the criminal justice system, and then they choose not to engage with the criminal justice system again because they feel like nothing happened. I reported this, I was scared, I told you who I thought did this, and nothing happened from it. So in looking at how we're improving our coordinated response, not only do we want to focus on what can we do for accountability in the criminal justice system, but what also can we do to enhance safety? And I appreciate that so many of you immediately went to, how can we safety plan around this? Do we safety plan around the vehicle being accessed? Do we safety plan around the house being accessed? Who else can support the victim through this process, et cetera? And I'm guessing that many of you had responses based on what you do for a living, what your discipline is. So those of you that are advocates probably immediately jump to the safety planning. Those of you that are law enforcement or district attorneys are jumping to the, what do I have to hold the offender accountable in this criminal case? And how do we put both of those pieces together to enhance the safety of victims while we're trying to hold these offenders accountable? So as we look at this particular coordinated response, it's common to see that it's going to take a lot of time and energy and resources. And what we often see happen in cases like this is there may be an incident report that was taken, but there may not be an incident report that was taken. And one of the things that we have to think about in stalking crimes, especially, is if we are relying on a pattern of behavior or a course of conduct, if the first incident was never documented, was never written down, was never responded to, then every time the victim reaches out for help, we're starting with incident one. And we can never prove the pattern of conduct or pattern of behavior if we never have documented the first incident. And so oftentimes when things like this happen, people think it's a minor incident. It's not that big of a deal. There was no actual harm, physical harm, that happened to the victim. Now, all of us would say lots of emotional harm. We can make lots of arguments. But the thing I want you to be thinking about is, especially in stalking crimes, when we're trying to build a coordinated response, our documentation, our response when incidents like this happen is really important. Because victims may decide not to engage with us going forward, depending on this response. And we can't ever prove a course of conduct if we've never documented the first time they reached out to us. So be thinking about that, thinking about what would the reaction be in your community and how can we change that going forward. Obviously, we have statutes all across the country that address stalking. As I alluded to earlier, they're all different. None of them are the same. Each state has a statute regarding stalking, with the exception of those of you, I noticed somebody earlier posted you're from West Virginia. West Virginia's stalking statute isn't called stalking. It's a stalking statute, it's just not called that. So we say all 50 states have a stalking statute, even if it's not named as that. But it's also important to remember that many tribal jurisdictions have tribal codes that address stalking as well. And so if we're talking about truly coordinating the response within our communities, we have to think about all the different sources of justice that victims might access and all the different ways that we can hold offenders accountable, including things like the federal crime of stalking. So if you cross in and out of tribal jurisdictions or over state lines, you have committed the federal crime of stalking. Now, that does not mean that every case would go forward with a federal prosecution in cases like that, but it is an avenue of accountability. And think about, if you're coordinating your response in your community, do you have a military base or a military community that's part of your community? Because the UCMJ, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, also addresses stalkings. There might be some accountability and safety measures that can be accessed through that system as well. So one of the things that we want to think about as we look at these particular cases and move forward is, I asked very early on, how many of you have a coordinated response to stalking? And not surprisingly, many of you didn't. And that could be skewed by the fact that that's why you're on this webinar, is because you want to build one. But what we see across the country is, we know the prevalence rates of stalking is about 1 in 3 women and 1 in 6 men experience stalking at some point in their lifetime. Let me also first acknowledge that that's a very binary women, men, and that does not encompass gender identity, sexual orientation that we see in lots of communities where we see a higher level of prevalence within the LGBTQ community. So I want to acknowledge that going forward, that I was not trying to just put them into men and women categories, that is what this particular survey addresses. But with the prevalence rates that you're seeing on your screen right now, how many of you are surprised by that high prevalence rate? And it doesn't count if you've seen a Spark webinar before. And I love Sherry clarifying for everybody who's like, what's going on in West Virginia? Yeah, the West Virginia statute isn't labeled as stalking, even though it really is stalking. So what do you think about the prevalence rates? If they're 1 in 3 and 1 in 6 men, those of you that are data nerds are like, oh wow, that prevalence rate is just as high as domestic violence and sexual assault, or higher. Yes, exactly, Lori, thank you. So if the prevalence rates are higher than what we see for domestic violence and sexual assault, that means all of us are working with more stalking victims and stalking offenders than we are victims of domestic violence and sexual assault, right? Sarcasm doesn't translate very well across the webinar. I'm going to guess that there's probably very few of us who are working with just as many victims of domestic violence and sexual assault as we are victims of stalking. And I would say that because most of us were working with far fewer victims of stalking. And what we know is that oftentimes people say, well, we've got a really great response to stalking within our community, because when we have an offender come in and we're looking at that domestic violence case, we're screening for stalking behaviors. But oftentimes the response to stalking lies within the response to domestic violence. And that's pretty problematic in the fact that only 43% of stalking victims are stalked by a current or former intimate partner. So more often than not, the stalker is not a current or former intimate partner. They're an acquaintance, somebody the victims had a brief encounter with, a stranger, a family member. And so if the coordinated response to stalking in your community is relying on the fact that it's stemmed in the domestic violence response, that's problematic, right? And as Paulina said, yeah, we know our numbers are underreported as it is. We don't work with every victim of domestic violence or sexual assault, but I want you to think about how many victims of domestic violence and sexual assault you are working with compared to how many victims of stalking. And why do we think, if the prevalence rates are really that high, that we are failing to see the corresponding number of victims come through the criminal justice system? Why do you think it is in your jurisdiction, or if you want to point fingers at someone else's jurisdiction, why do you think they're not working with as many stalking victims as we are victims of domestic violence and sexual assault? Why do you think that is? Yeah, As Ashley said, sometimes victims don't identify what's happening to them as stalking, right? Yeah, or other people say it's only the stalking behavior. It's not like that individual is being harmed, right? And I appreciate that James is saying it could be that victims aren't identifying that they're being stalked, but it also could be we as responders aren't identifying that there's stalking happening in these crimes. And as Desiree said, a lot of times we're relying on documentation. I mean, if you think about it, stalking is a pretty unique crime in that we essentially say to victims, gather all the evidence, keep some really great documentation, and then bring it to us, and then we'll decide what we're going to do with it. Do we do that in any other crime? Do we essentially rely on victims to build their own cases in other crimes? I mean, a little bit in other violence against women crimes, but stalking is pretty unique in that we are relying on victims to build their own cases because so often the offenders aren't there when law enforcement responds. And so we have to be thinking about, how does this play out within our criminal justice system? How are we increasing the education for victims that they can recognize what's happening to them as stalking? And when they mention it to us, how are we improving our ability to identify what's happening is actually stalking? And one of the things that we know is that oftentimes there is believed by victims to be what is thought of as like a legitimate crime, and that if there has been harm, physical harm that has happened to them, or if it meets some kind of like stereotypical definition. So for stalking, that means it's somebody I don't know who's sitting across the street, monitoring me, watching me with binoculars, and is going to pose some kind of physical or sexual harm to me. Then that's a legitimate stalking case, and then that's when I might go forward to report something. When we all know that those aren't the typical stalking cases. And that influences victims' decision to come and report, but it also influences our decision-making as responders, because we have those same perceptions about what stalking is or is not when victims come in and reach out to us for help. What we know is that victims who know their offenders are much more likely to be fearful of that offender than individuals who are being stalked by a stranger. But those individuals who are stalked by someone that they know are less likely to report. So individuals who are stalked by a stranger are more likely to come in and make a report, even though they feel less fearful than individuals who are stalked by a current or former intimate partner or an acquaintance and do experience a lot of fear. So we kind of have this like juxtaposition of individuals are experiencing a high level of fear because they know what the offender is capable of, and yet oftentimes don't reach out for services or come to report to law enforcement because of what their perceived notion is of what's a legitimate stalking crime. And when they do come forward, we also know that oftentimes those of us that are working in the system, the cases that move through the system oftentimes have the stereotypical components of a stranger stalker, somebody who's posed physical or sexual harm to the victim, and we're less likely to move forward other cases of stalking. And so let me give you some specific examples to be thinking about. So as we move forward, I want you to think about, as we look at these particular cases, we see a lot of challenges within the criminal justice system when it comes to stalking. Those cases oftentimes appear really insignificant in the beginning, like the case that we started off with, the beer bottle cat. No physical harm that has come to the victim. We don't even know if we can prove if it was a crime was even committed. We also have to think about, within the context of domestic violence, are we overlooking stalking? When I've encouraged you to think about the response within your jurisdiction, I've already limited us because what we see happen in so many stalking crimes is it spills over from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Because we have a victim who lives in one jurisdiction, who works in another jurisdiction, and an offender lives in a third jurisdiction. And how are we coordinating our response across those jurisdictions to hold offenders accountable as well? And then we've talked a little bit about how resource intensive these particular investigations are. So when we're looking at the stalking behavior, and I appreciate that so many of you are like, I don't know that victims are identifying that what is happening to them as stalking, and I don't know if we are either. One of the things that I would encourage you to adapt is this particular framework that we refer to as the SLI framework. And it stands for surveillance, life invasion, interference, and intimidation. And what we know is that when there's surveillance behavior happening on the part of the offender towards the victim, that's when the offender is doing those stereotypical things like following the victim, they're watching the victim, they're accessing their social media. When this type of behavior is happening, victims are more likely to identify that they're being stalked. And those of us who are responders are more likely to identify that this is a stalking case. So when we look at the SLI framework, if the surveillance category is happening, those are the cases that are more likely to make it through the criminal justice system. We miss, however, the things like life invasion, where the offender might be making unwanted contact at the victim's home, where they're showing up at Walmart, at the gas station, at the kids' baseball games, just happening to run into the victim. We all know it's not a coincidence, whether we can prove that or not. If the offender is invading the victim's property, we see lots of stalking crimes that are actually tied to property crimes or come in first as property crimes. The victim knows exactly who's doing it and identifies the stalker, but nothing is moved forward. And we may or may not even list the potential suspect on that incident report. And then we have offenders obviously harassing the victim's friends and family members, as well as engaging in things like sabotaging a victim's work or finances. They might be trying to ruin a victim's reputation. So if the victim is, owns their own business in the community, they might be trying to ruin the reputation of that business or cost that business some money so that the victim loses their livelihood. If they're an intimate partner, they might be interfering with custody or attacking friends and family. We see a lot of offenders who cause a scene someplace public, and that prohibits the victim from leaving that particular place. So, they might confront the victim outside their place of work and cause a scene, and the victim's like, please, not here, not now. I don't want to be embarrassed in front of my coworkers. I'll talk to you later about this. And then the offender gets what they want because they meet with the victim later and can inflict even more harm because the victim didn't want to be embarrassed in front of other people. And then the last category is the intimidation factors that we see overlap so often with domestic violence cases, where the offender is threatening the victim, that they're engaging in what we call symbolic violence. Symbolic violence is perfectly illustrated by the beer bottle cap scenario that we went through earlier. That beer bottle cap scenario would mean nothing to anyone else unless you knew the context in those particular situations. And that was what we call an act of symbolic violence, something that the offender knew would mean something to the victim, that to the rest of us was like, I don't understand. And then of course we see offenders who threaten to harm themselves or other people as well. What happens is when victims come forward to make reports within the criminal justice system, or for those of you who are doing advocacy work, when they come in and are working and identifying safety issues, typically it's around the surveillance behavior. And what happens oftentimes is there's a whole bunch of other behavior that's happening, a whole bunch of other things that the offender is doing that we could use to prove our course of conduct or a pattern of behavior that we don't find out about, and that we are essentially relying on victims to tell us about. I can tell you, it never fails to surprise me when I've worked on a stalking case where victims have a whole bunch of other information that they don't end up telling law enforcement, or that they don't tell the prosecuting attorney about in their case. And when we look at why victims don't disclose that information, we ask them, why didn't you share that with law enforcement? Why didn't you bring up the fact that they were showing up at your work and making you lose your job? And do you know what victims say to us? Because you didn't ask. I didn't tell you because you didn't ask the right question. And what we see over and over again in stalking crimes is victims don't know what is supposed to be used as probable cause, what the threshold is, what these important behaviors might or might not mean. And they're relying on us to ask the right questions. And oftentimes what happens in stalking cases is people say, well, we screen for stalking all the time. And I'm like, awesome, tell me what you ask. And people say, well, we ask victims, are you being stalked? That's not the right question. Because what we know from research and from decades of working with stalking victims is if you ask a victim of stalking, are you being stalked or are you being harassed? In a majority of the time, they're going to say no. Because it's not a stranger sitting across the street with binoculars watching me. It's somebody I know and I love who's trying to ruin my reputation. And if you go back to the very definition of stalking, whether the legal definition or the behavioral definition, you are trying to prove a pattern of behavior. And that pattern of behavior only gets established if we're asking victims the right questions about what has been occurring. So one of the things I want you to start thinking about is if you're trying to improve the response to stalking in your community, we have to be asking the right questions. And those questions can't be, are you being stalked? They need to be things like, are you experiencing someone who's trying to threaten to harm themselves if you don't respond? Are you experiencing somebody showing up at your work? Are you experiencing somebody interfering with your custody? Are you experiencing somebody monitoring your social media? Then oftentimes victims say, well, yeah, all that's happening. Those are stalking behaviors. But so often we don't call on that. You know, every year for Stalking Awareness Month, which happens to be the month of January, we use the tagline, stalking, know it, name it, stop it. And that sounds really simple, but the know it, name it piece is not that simple, because people oftentimes have a perception of what they believe stalking to be, or they're relying on a very strict legal definition, and we're not asking the right questions or digging deep enough to figure out all the different behaviors that might encompass stalking behaviors. And if we're truly going to improve our response to stalking, we have to be doing that. I'm curious to hear from any of you in the chat who've attended a SPARK training before. Have you adapted the SPY framework? Have you changed the questions you've started to ask? And if so, how did that work for you? That's where you're all going to be quiet and I'm going to be sad. Anybody want to share? I know there's some of you that have, because I recognize your name in the chat, but I won't call you out. Or if you haven't, and this is the first time you're hearing about the SLY framework, how do you think that would be useful, or how do you envision using it in the work that you do? Any thoughts? Oh, I'm sure you're all writing in the chat. I'll give you an example. James is like, time to call the people out. That's because James is probably one of the people who hasn't been at training before and you just want to see other people squirm. Lori says we've implemented this screening tool for the SLY framework. So understanding and asking questions about the surveillance, the life invasion, the intimidation and interference. We also have on our website questions for law enforcement to ask within each category, within the surveillance category, within the life invasion, within the intimidation, to use as questions to ask in stalking investigations. So that's a way that you could adapt the SLY framework to ask about those questions. For those of you that are advocacy folks, you might be thinking, well, I'm not trying to prove a crime, like I'm safety planning with victims. But if we don't understand the full scope of the offender's behavior, how are we supposed to adequately safety plan? I've used the SLY framework before to anticipate what the offender might do next, because we know oftentimes if an offender is arrested or if there's a civil protection order entered and the offender is, prohibited from telephoning, contacting, or communicating with the victim, they still look at the victim's social media. They still show up in public places. They still try to show up at work. The behavior usually doesn't stop. Typically, the offender just changes the behavior. And so SLY can be a way to think about what might happen next and how do we safety plan with the victim about those potential next steps. Anybody else want to volunteer anything in the chat? This is when I don't like not being in person. Somebody said the surveillance behaviors are kind of covered in the lethality assessment for law enforcement, but the other ones have to be asked them. Yeah, so James, I'm assuming you're referring to the lethality assessment protocol, which is the common domestic violence assessment for law enforcement to use when they respond. I agree with you. Those surveillance behaviors, so on the LAP, there's 2 questions specifically about monitoring the victim's behavior and being overly jealous and controlling. Yep, questions 6 and 11 on the LAP that cover some of that behavior, but it doesn't delve specifically into stalking behavior, and we're relying on victims to either tell us that or for us to be able to identify other stalking behaviors that are happening besides those just particular questions. And delving into that, we're going to next talk about the intersection between stalking and domestic violence and how do we leverage some of those tools that we might be using, like the LAP, to also look at some of the risks that are posed uniquely in stalking cases. So James, you set me up for that one perfectly, so thank you. So one of the things that we also want to be thinking about when we're looking at stalking crimes is some states require that the offender intended to cause harm to the victim. And then we always have a suspect who says, I didn't intend to make the victim scared. It was just a coincidence that I showed up there. I was just trying to get back together with the victim. I just wanted to see my kids. It was just a coincidence because we both work at the same place. And so one of the things that we also want you to think about is how do we prove intent? Because the offender is always going to say, I didn't intend for this to happen. And one of the strategies that we can use is to use that SLI framework, the surveillance, the life invasion, the intimidation and interference, as well as look at the duration, the intensity, and the frequency of behaviors. We call that the Diff Pattern. This work has so many acronyms, but the duration of the behavior. So things like, how long has the stalking been going on? How and when did it start? Were there situational factors that contributed to it? Can we look at a course of conduct versus incident-based? What does that look like in our investigations? What does the intensity look like? Are we looking at the full scope of tactics that the offender is using? How many different tactics are they using to gather access to the victim? So the offender might be able to explain, oh, it's just a coincidence that I showed up at Walmart. Is it also a coincidence that I've been showing up in 3 other different places? And I keep calling the victim all the time, and I keep text messaging them, and I also try to get a hold of their mom, and I also tried to gain access to their kids. The intensity of those particular behaviors. Where do those behaviors happen? Do they happen in places where they can't be held accountable, where it's a public place like Walmart? Do they happen when there's no one around to witness them, where it would be just the victim? What other areas of a victim's life has the offender invaded? Has it been the victim's public life, but also interfering with the victim's online presence? Have they also shown up at the victim's work? And what do those patterns of behavior look like? Do they go on again, off again? Do they have a tendency to happen around Valentine's Day and the anniversary of their wedding? How public is the stalking? As well as how frequent is it? Has the offender, how often are they approaching the victim? How often are they confronting the victim? Does the victim feel threatened for their safety, etc.? Looking at the duration and the intensity and the frequency and all the different SLI behaviors can oftentimes help us prove the intent, because those things help us prove that there's a pattern to the offender's behavior. And when there's a pattern to the offender's behavior, it helps us prove intent. So one of the things to be thinking about is, how are we documenting this pattern? How are we documenting all the things that the victim is experiencing, including how long it's been happening, how frequent it happens, and how intense those behaviors are? But again, oftentimes we're relying on victims to keep that information for us. And so we're going to talk about some of the documentation logs and other things that we can use in these particular cases. We also want to talk about how stalking intersects with intimate partner violence. Now, keeping in mind that we don't just want to focus on intimate partner stalking, but that we know that intimate partner stalking happens frequently and gets missed very frequently in domestic violence cases. These are just 3 studies that were done with different questions, with different people, with different results. but with the same talking point, in that within the context of domestic violence, we oftentimes miss the stalking behavior. So for instance, the middle one was the Violence Against Women survey that looked at almost 1,800 domestic violence reports taken by law enforcement. And within those 1,800 law enforcement reports, there was enough evidence within the police report in almost 300 of them where they could have also charged stalking in addition to domestic violence. And how many cases resulted in an arrest for stalking? 1. On the right, the Brady and Nobles study looked at almost 3,800 calls for service in the Houston Police Department. And out of those 3,800 calls for service, meaning the victim identified that they were being stalked, they called law enforcement for help. Out of those, only 66 resulted in an incident report. Do you think the other 3,690 some had nothing to do with stalking? Do we think that many victims called in for a report to be taken and there wasn't actually stalking that was happening? And out of those, there was 0 arrests for stalking. Because what we know happens in a lot of domestic violence cases is the stalking is either overlooked or mislabeled. Let me give you an example. When we have a domestic violence victim who's in the process of leaving a domestic violence relationship, and they're still in that relationship, and we're working with that individual, and the offender is really jealous, and they're really controlling, and they monitor the victim's social media, and they don't allow the victim to have a job or friends, etc. One of the things that we have to be thinking about is we oftentimes fit that behavior into the power and control wheel that we use oftentimes to frame domestic violence. And we say that offender is really jealous, they're really controlling. We label it as intimidation in our nice, neat little power and control wheel here. We talk about the offender using privilege. And we all say, hey, that's part of what happens in a domestic violence situation. We know that it doesn't have to be just the physical or sexual violence. We know that that jealous, controlling, isolating behavior is part of the domestic violence. And then if the victim leaves the offender, and the offender is monitoring their social media, and they're calling the victim, and they're preventing them from having a job, and they're trying to sabotage their relationships, then and only then we might call it stalking, because the victim's not together with the offender anymore. But when they were still together and the offender was monitoring their social media, and they were isolating the victim, they were really threatening, and they were really jealous, and they were really controlling, is that not also a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear? That's stalking behavior. We just didn't call it that. We just chalked it up to part of the dynamics that happen in a domestic violence case. And some of you might be thinking, what does it matter, Jen? Who cares what we call it? We're still going to try to hold people accountable. Well, it matters for a couple of reasons. Number one, our intimate partner stalkers are much more likely to physically approach a victim. They're more likely to use weapons. They're some of our most dangerous stalkers. And what we know is that if you have an incident where you have domestic violence plus stalking, you have some of our most potentially lethal domestic violence situations. If I were to ask all of you, what are the lethality factors in a domestic violence case? Most of you would say things like the victim's pregnant, the victim's trying to leave, the victim's been strangled, they've been sexually assaulted. But what we also know is in that 85% of attempted and 76% of completed intimate partner femicides, there's been an episode of stalking within the year prior to the murder. But if we never called it stalking, we never charged it, we never safety planned around it, how were we supposed to know that this is a case that has the potential to end up in homicide? Because what we know is that stalking is the number 8 lethality factor in domestic violence cases. Most of us would look at things like access to firearms, the strangulation, but stalking plus domestic violence results in a threefold increase in the risk of the victim being killed by the offender. Threefold increase. And yet I'm guessing most of you who are doing lethality assessments in domestic violence cases, those of you that are using the lethality assessment protocol or the danger assessment by Dr. Jacqueline Campbell, most of us have been taught to look at factors besides the stalking behavior. And stalking has been just lumped in as part of the controlling behavior that happens in domestic violence. But when we look at these particular cases, those cases that involve DV plus stalking are some of our most dangerous cases. Yeah, and as James said, one of the things that happens is these incidents happen in different law enforcement jurisdictions. Victims believe that there's some magic database in the sky that you can look up to see if I've contacted law enforcement before. And that doesn't always exist. Some jurisdictions share information, but not all of them. And we're relying on victims to be able to tell us, I've reported this before to so-and-so. There's an active police report. I've made a report about X, Y, or Z. And that oftentimes doesn't happen. And so we treat each incident as the first incident because we fail to get the relevant information from our neighboring jurisdictions, which is why we have to be coordinating our response to victims of stalking, because it isn't a single jurisdiction issue. It happens across jurisdictions all the time. Somebody said in New York, yeah, you can check the repository for past DV incidents for all jurisdictions, but also think about those incidents that don't necessarily get chalked up as DV. Things like disturbing the peace or malicious injury to property or whatever your state statute might encompass or not encompass. And your particular state might not have a database like that. And so thinking about what information has been taken, let alone are we relying on the fact that the incident report was taken, was it entered into a system, et cetera. So we've made some good progress in places like New York where we're trying to get those particular things available to us so that we can see what's happened in neighboring jurisdictions. But we also have to think about the fact that many times we're relying on victims to be able to tell us that those reports have been made, right? And it's fair to say sometimes night shift doesn't know what day shift is doing, right? Some of us work in jurisdictions where that communication is hard because we're spread really thin. Or we have one piece of information and maybe the prosecutor has another piece of information and then the victim advocate has another piece of information. How are we putting all those pieces of the puzzle together, right? But I agree with you, Thomas. I think there's a lot of places where we've started to make some progress there. And how do we bring it to fruition? How do we make it a little bit more seamless and a little bit more possible for victims to be able to not have to be relied on so heavily to provide all this information to us, but what can we provide to one another to be able to hold offenders accountable in these particular cases? I love that all of you are volunteering this great information in the chat. Thank you so much. So some of you might be saying, okay, well, Jennifer, you told me earlier I can't ask a victim of stalking, are you being stalked? So how do I screen for stalking within the context of intimate partner violence? Here's 4 questions that we would suggest you ask. Has anybody been following or monitoring you in any way? Have they invaded your life or privacy by making unwanted contact with you? Have they significantly and directly interfered with your life, held you against your will, prohibited you from leaving someplace, attacked someone close to you? Or have they on more than one time intimidated or scared you through things like property damage, harming your pets, etc.? Those 4 questions are the SLY framework. The first one's on surveillance, the second one's on life invasion, interference, and intimidation. And so one of the things you can start thinking about is if you're working with a domestic violence victim, are we also screening for stalking? And are we asking these questions? And if we get a yes answer to those particular questions, then what? Do we have a victim who, because of those actions, is scared for their safety or someone else? Have they made some life changes? One of the things that I like to ask victims is, what has changed for you since all of this has started? And oftentimes you'll have victims who will say things like, I don't hang out at the bar anymore. I don't leave my house. I switched from night shifts to day shift or day shifts to night shift so I can sleep. I took time off of work. I got a security camera. I bought a dog. All of those things that can show the impact that the stalking has had on the victim, which can help us prove the emotional distress or fear element that we're often struggling to prove in a stalking crime. And did those actions make the victim afraid or concerned about some kind of financial or social impact? Were they worried they were going to lose their job? Were they were worried that there was going to be some kind of financial harm? Their credit was going to be harmed because the offender's stealing their identity. So thinking about, are we asking those particular questions? And Emma, if you would, in the chat, jump on Dropbox, and we actually have a PDF of the slides today that you can drop in the chat for everyone. In case you're like, wait, I didn't get all those questions written down in time, you all have an access to the slides there. So Emma's going to put that in the chat for us. And I love how many of you have alluded to the fact, well, we ask questions either using like the lethality assessment protocol or some other threat assessment in domestic violence cases. What we would also encourage is to think about threat and risk assessment within the context of stalking cases. And many people are not aware that there's actually risk factors that exist in stalking cases that pose an increased risk of danger for victims or for offenders, which is always scary because if we have an offender who's at increased risk of harming themselves, many times they will also harm the victim. And so the 14 risk factors in stalking cases can be kind of put into 4 different categories. So the risk factors that we're looking for in stalking cases are how much of the sly behaviors have been happening. That's the course of conduct. Has there been an escalation in this particular case? Is there any upcoming trigger? Do we have a court case that's going? Is the offender going to be violated for their probation? Has the victim applied for a civil protection order? Has the victim contacted law enforcement? That's a potential trigger. What we also can think about is there any particular threat that has been happening, and what's the offender's capability of following through with those threats? Is there a history of abuse towards the victim, towards other people? Has the offender had access to either guns or weapons or something similar to that? If that's the case, then we know that there may be the potential that the offender has the risk of increasing their violence. Do they have a criminal history or a mental health history? Lots of folks have a tendency to think that individuals who are stalkers will have a lengthy criminal justice history. And what we actually know is the opposite. Oftentimes, stalkers have no criminal justice history. They are very adept at talking their way out of things, and so they have not had any prior criminal history. Also, people have a tendency to think that stalkers struggle with mental health issues. Well, certainly there are a portion of stalkers that have mental health issues. Stalking isn't caused by mental health concern, typically. Stalking is typically caused by power and control issues. So don't confuse what seems to be mental health issues with power and control issues in stalking cases. We also know that if we have an offender who is a substance abuse user, that they may be more likely to be able to inflict harm upon our victim. We also want to look at the stalker's mindset. How persistent are they in engaging in the stalking, which can also prove intent? Has the victim taken steps to try to avoid the stalker, like making a report to law enforcement, getting a civil protection order, and the offender is still persisting? But we also want to keep in mind that oftentimes in stalking cases, people want victims to kind of draw a clear line in the sand and then to not engage with the offender. And that's not always realistic. And we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. We also want to see what the stalker's motive is. Are they trying to get back together with the victim? Do they want revenge on the victim? Are they obsessed with the victim? Are they engaging in what we call proxy stalking? So proxy stalking is where you use a third party to stalk someone. So that can be oftentimes the stalker will use like a friend of theirs or a family member to engage in the stalking. Sometimes because we've prohibited them from making contact with a victim, like there's a civil protection order in place, and so then they get their buddy to make contact or something like that. And how vulnerable is our victim? Is the victim fearful of what will happen? Has their life been impacted in significant ways? Is the offender using some kind of technology to access them? And I love that somebody had put in the chat earlier, with the invention of cell phones and social media, et cetera, the ways that you can contact somebody has become much more prolific. And next week's webinar is on the use of technology to stalk, so please tune in for that one. as well as how vulnerable is our victim? Does our victim have to live or work near the offender? Do they share custody in common? What does that victim vulnerability look like? And what we know is when we're looking at stalking cases and trying to assess the level of risk in these particular stalking cases, when we're looking at these 14 risk factors that have been proven by research to increase the risk of safety to increase the risk of the victim's safety in these particular cases, one of the tools that we can also consider using is using a risk assessment. And the risk assessment that looks at those 14 risk factors that I just went through with you is called SHARP. And it stands for the Stalking, Harassment, Assessment, and Risk Profile. And what SHARP does is it's an online assessment that you can do that generates two things. It gives you a narrative report and a risk profile about the case that you're looking at. And it also gives you safety planning suggestions. Now, everybody's like, how quickly can I do this? Like, can I use one of these on the scene? Like, how do I assess risk in stalking cases? And I'm going to tell you, jurisdictions across the country really vary in how they're using this in elevating their coordinated response to stalking. Some jurisdictions will ask those screening questions, those 4 slide questions that I had on a slide earlier for you. We'll ask those questions and have the responding patrol officer ask those questions when they respond to a potential stalking or domestic violence case. Other jurisdictions then use SHARP and the risk assessment at the investigative level, or they have a victim advocate who's working with the victim in the case, either a systems-based advocate in a law enforcement office or a prosecutor's office, or a community-based advocacy in a domestic violence program, do a SHARP assessment as well. And doing so, oftentimes people are stunned to find out that there is a lot more going on in the case than the victim had initially told them about. I can tell you personally that there has never been a case that I have worked on where I had all the information before SHARP that I had after SHARP. Does not mean that I have not had lots of experience working in these cases and I've asked lots of great questions, but there's always something there that gets revealed through the process of doing a SHARP profile with a victim. And you can do those in a couple of ways. You can do them without a victim being present. You can just jump on and see, how do I, assess the risk in this particular case and answer questions about SHARP. Or you can do it with a victim present who can give you the information. I wouldn't advise that you tell victims to do it on their own unless you've put some pretty big caveats in there for safety. Because, yeah, and we'll put the link in for the slides here in just a second. The thing that I would, think about when it comes to safety, et cetera, in those cases is that when you're doing something like that and you say, for instance, instruct a victim to look at those particular cases, it can be pretty traumatic for victims to not be warned ahead of time about all the different questions that SHARP is going to ask. And so I wouldn't recommend that victims just do SHARP on their own without having some kind of support person there with them. But when you go through SHARP, one of the options is that you can start a SHARP assessment and it'll say, are you just testing a case out? Like, are you just kind of trying to get more information about a certain case? Are you kind of playing around with the assessment to get information about it? And I highly encourage all of you to do that with SHARP so that you become familiar with it. The one thing that I will warn you about is SHARP is 48 questions. And I know some of you just went, seriously, Jennifer? I don't have time to do 48 questions. I can do a SHARP assessment in about 7 minutes. They're yes, no questions, and like extremely likely, unlikely, like the Likert scale of questions. So it does not take a long time to do an assessment. The other thing that's really nice about SHARP is it also gives you the safety planning suggestions about this particular case. And that's something that you can print off and give to the victim that you're working with. Now, that doesn't replace referring to all the great community partners that you have in your coordinated response, advocates, et cetera, mental health providers, but it does provide a great way of elevating those specific risks in a stalking case. So if you've never used SHARP, I highly encourage you to think about using it. If anybody is on this webinar who's used SHARP before, if you want to put comments or feedback about SHARP in the chat for other people to hear from someone other than just me. That's super helpful if you want to include that, if you had the opportunity to use Sharp before, because I know several of you had. So as we're bringing all of these pieces together, hopefully I've encouraged you to start thinking about, okay, where can we kind of fill in some of the gaps that we might be missing in our response to stalking victims, and who else do we need to bring to the table? I purposely left one piece of this puzzle empty when we look at the response, because I don't know all of your jurisdictions, and I don't know who else should be sitting around the table in working on stalking cases and improving your community response. Typically, CCRs include people like law enforcement and prosecutors and advocates. What I find in a lot of stalking coordinated responses is people are like, oh, we don't really have medical people there because they don't really need to be there because it's not like it's a sexual assault. There are a lot of stalking survivors who access medical professionals either for psychosomatic complaints like headaches and stomach aches, etc., or who are accessing their healthcare professional because they trust them and have more access to them than anybody else. So please make sure you're including both your medical and mental health professionals in your response, as well as thinking about those folks who are in your educational system. If you have a college system, you see a huge amount of stalking that happens in adolescence between the ages of like 14 and 18 and even younger. And so how are we looking to address those particular cases before they end up in our adult court system? As well as what are some of the community specific resources? Do you have agencies within your community that are working within the LGBTQ community, that are working within the Latina community? And how are we leveraging the access and amazing relationships they have with the community to also inform our coordinated response to victims? Keeping in mind that victims don't live single issue lives, okay? They don't go to school, then go to their house of faith, then go home, and they only experience stalking at home. Like, the stalking invades every single part of their life. And so we must build a response that also addresses every single part of their life. So go beyond thinking just the big four of law enforcement, advocacy, prosecution, and health professionals to thinking about who else has access to victims and where else are victims reaching out for help. And as we build that response, thinking about what is it that we're all focusing on. And one of the things that we would encourage you to think about as far as a strategy for your coordinated response is focusing on risk. It's why we brought up the Sharp assessment, looking at these particular cases, because people are always surprised once they do a Sharp assessment that they might be like, I don't know, I think there's maybe 3 risk factors in a stalking case, and then they do a Sharp assessment and there's 11. Thinking about, do you do some kind of case review? If you already have a domestic violence or a sexual assault coordinated response and you're doing case review, are you including stalking cases? Are you including non-intimate partner stalking cases? And how do we build a comprehensive approach? One of the things that's super frustrating to lots of victims, and I'd say to a lot of us who are responders in this field, is that sometimes we luck into a good response for a victim. Like, a victim goes in to make a report and they happen to get the one person who's had stalking training, or they have access to the one victim advocate who knows the options available for stalking victims in their community. And I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm not okay with victims lucking into a good response. I want a victim of stalking to, no matter who they reach out to, whether they walk in the doors of a law enforcement office or they reach out to a victim advocacy agency, to be given the same level of support and access to resources, no matter who they happen to encounter. And many of us very quickly point fingers at people in our coordinated response who aren't doing a good job. We go to jurisdictions all the time and people say, well, if our law enforcement would do a better job of. Look inside your own house. Within your agency, does any person who have access to victims or offenders have adequate training and understanding about stalking? Or are you the one person from your office who attended this webinar? And how are you sharing that information? And how are we coming up with strategies to monitor offenders who, for instance, get placed on probation? because lots of stalking offenders do. And what does safety planning look like for the victims that we're working with? Where can they reach out for services? Are you sure your domestic violence and sexual assault program would work with victims of stalking who aren't intimate partners? Or would a victim be screened out of services? And one of the things that we would suggest is, for steps forward for all of you, is to think about what kind of training is available on stalking. If you haven't had access to training before on stalking, how long have you been doing this work? It is not unusual for us to go into jurisdictions, people to say, I'm required to attend 10 domestic violence trainings and 10 sexual assault trainings every year. And we say, how many stalking trainings have you had? And they said none. So how are you sharing this information? You can reach out to Spark to ask for additional training, especially if you have an improving criminal justice response grant or any Office on Violence Against Women grants. Spark is one of your technical assistance providers. We can provide that training for you, either via webinar or in person. We have a training request button on our website that you can request training from. What does it look like to take training back to those within your jurisdiction? Can you watch a recorded webinar that Spark has on our website and show that at your next CCR meeting? What do your policies and procedures look like? Would you have a policy on stalking? I'm betting many of you have a policy on domestic violence or sexual assault, especially for those of you that are in law enforcement. You oftentimes have you catch a DV case, this is exactly what you're going to do, and it spells it out. Is there a policy on stalking for both intimate partner and non-intimate partner? For those of you who are victim advocates who are like, oh, we don't need the policy, we work with everybody who walks through our doors. The victim of stalking called your hotline at 2 o'clock in the morning and said, my neighbor's harassing me, I need a safe place to stay. Would they be given that safe place to stay? Or would they be told that we only work with victims of domestic violence in our shelter, so you need to call the homeless shelter? Because victims tell us all the time that they're screened out of services. What do your practices look like? We can all say we do a really good job, but what does that look like? People tell me all the time, oh, we've got a fabulous response to stalking. We absolutely address it. And then I look at their website and the word stalking isn't even mentioned. Many people apply for improving criminal justice response grants and say, we're going to focus on stalking. We're going to spend 20% of our time working on stalking. And then the progress report shows that they work less than 1% of their time on stalking cases. And a lot of times people say, well, that's just because we don't have that many stalking survivors who access our services. When the prevalence rates would show you that they're there, they're just not accessing us. So why is that? The other thing we would encourage you to be thinking about is, for those of you that are law enforcement, does your agency have that stalking policy? How are non-intimate partner stalking cases identified? If that Corona beer bottle case that we talked about at the very beginning had a victim who said, I think this is somebody who asked me out at my work and I turned them down, would that case be written up as a potential property crime, as a breaking and entering? Would it be identified as a stalking crime? Would an incident report even be taken? And who oftentimes controls whether we're dispatched out to something? Dispatch. How much training have they had on stalking? Is somebody going through call logs and incident reports? What does it look like if things come in as property crimes versus crimes against people? Now, some of us work in small enough jurisdictions that we catch everything, but in a lot of jurisdictions, things are parceled out by property crimes and crimes against people. Has anybody ever looked through the property crime incidents reports to see how many of them are probably stalking crimes? Are we screening for stalking within those reports? Are we understanding that when we make contact with victims, that first contact is really important? How many of you have a packet of information that you give out to victims of stalking? I bet you probably have it for victims of domestic violence and sexual assault, probably because it's required by statute. But do you have referral programs? Do you have victims' rights cards? Are those given out to victims of stalking? Do you give victims of stalking a documentation log? Are we preserving evidence right now? Are we prepared for the long haul that these particular cases might take? Are we also thinking about what happens when we can't charge stalking? Can we do a warning call to the offender? Can we say, stop it? And if you continue, we're going to issue a trespass warning, and then you're going to be taken to jail. What happens with other charges that might be able to be leveraged in these particular crimes? And how are we monitoring these particular cases? For those of you that are in the prosecution offices, where are we looking at stalking within the context of domestic violence and sexual assault? Can we also leverage stalking charges in addition to the domestic violence charges? And we're going to be covering that a lot more within our third webinar here in a couple of weeks. But also, what has been happening that's intended to elicit a reaction from the victim? What else has the offender been doing that they know would result in a reaction from the victim? And how are we leveraging that within our prosecution? Are we doing things like prohibiting firearms? Are we opposing the defense's demands for private information? Are we using expert testimony? Many jurisdictions across the country are using expert testimony in domestic violence cases. Could be doing the same thing in stalking cases. Are we looking at things like forfeiture by wrongdoing if we have an offender who has stalked a victim and now the victim's not participating in our criminal justice case anymore? Are we also looking at options as far as other co-occurring crimes? And all of this is covered in our prosecution guide to stalking that's available on our website. So please consider that going forward. For those of you that might be corrections folks, what does it look like to screen for stalking? Are we putting in specialized conditions for stalkers? A lot of times we have specialized domestic violence caseloads. What does that look like for stalkers and stalking caseloads? Are we also making sure that we're looking at some of the prohibitions that we can put in place or special conditions as part of probation and parole? We actually co-wrote a guide with the American Probation and Parole Association that's available on our website that you can look at that guide. And thank you, Emma, for linking it in chat. For those of you that are medical professionals, what does it look like to screen for stalking? Would somebody know stalking if it was mentioned? Are mental health providers skilled in working with stalking victims? And for those of us that are doing advocacy work, what does that look like? Do we have training on stalking? What are our shelter options look like? We actually have a checklist on our website that goes through organizations that are domestic violence and sexual assault focused and say, okay, if you're working with stalking victims, do you also have this available? Do you have a policy on this? What does it look like as far as stalking being mentioned on your website? Do you have stalking brochures? Do you have documentation logs? And that's not just for the advocacy agencies, that would be for many of us as well. So that checklist is available on our website. And Emma is a step ahead of me and already has it linked in the chat, as well as an advocacy guide available in both English and Spanish for those of you that are doing advocacy work on how do we advocate for victims of stalking. And as we're working with stalking victims, keeping in mind that many stalking victims are most afraid of not knowing what's going to happen next. And that uncertainty oftentimes results in a lot of frustration and their unwillingness to participate in the criminal justice system because they don't see any benefit in doing so. So keeping in mind as you're moving forward, how are we building a system that's more accessible to victims? And what are we providing them as far as safety planning suggestions and enhancing the accountability of those offenders that are targeting them? Because what we know is lots of individuals who are experiencing stalking have a high level of fear, even if they aren't using the words, I'm scared. They may be able to talk about things that they've done as far as security measures. They might talk about their inability to eat and sleep. Asking victims what's changed for you since the stalking started. Oftentimes victims will say things like, you know, I've changed my job, I don't eat, I don't sleep, etc. All of those things can help you corroborate the emotional distress or fear piece that you might need in a stalking case, as well as understanding that we have to go beyond just the immediate safety planning concerns. One thing that I found after doing this work for a really long time is that with stalking survivors, we have a tendency to focus on the tactical safety planning. And people safety plan with stalking victims and say things like, do you have locks? Have you gotten a dog? Is somebody walking you back and forth to your vehicle after work? And we focus less on the emotional safety planning with stalking victims for some reason. And one of the things that we have to keep in mind is for victims to continue to participate in the criminal justice system, they have to have the support that is so desperately needed in the form of emotional support from all of us doing this particular work. It's also helpful if we can assist victims with some of the documentation needs that we might need in our criminal cases. One of the things that we often hear is people tell victims of stalking to keep a journal about what's been happening. We'd actually suggest an incident log. We have these available in English and Spanish on our website, and it just has the date, the time, the location of the incident, etc. So as to many of you who pointed out earlier, I'm sure you're my law enforcement officers on here, when we see things cross jurisdictions, we don't know that unless we perhaps have an incident log where the victim says the location of the incident was at Applebee's, and we're like, oh, well, that's why we don't have it on record, because Applebee's is in the county and we're in the city, and that's why we don't have it showing up within our system. So this documentation log can be really helpful for victims to be able to keep. It's on our website, available in English and Spanish, and on one side is the documentation log itself. On the other side is instructions to victims on how to keep the log. It can be very beneficial to use and to provide to victims of stalking. If you don't do anything else, this is a really simple win for improving your coordinated response to stalking, is to start using documentation logs in your cases, okay? Prosecutors find them really helpful to be able to use, because oftentimes we screen what we think is going to be the most important thing to include in our reports to prosecution. And the more information we have, the more incidents the prosecution has to be able to hold the offender accountable. And so there might be a lot of things that we don't necessarily have evidence for, or little things that we didn't think were important. And so often those little things in stalking cases are what builds an excellent stalking case. And so victims having access to a stalking incident log can be extremely helpful. The other thing that we need to keep in mind is that victims of stalking experience and cope in a bunch of different ways. And we all have a tendency to assign what we think is an acceptable way to cope and an unacceptable way to cope. And so when victims get civil protection orders, or they go into shelter, or they want to report to law enforcement, people think of that as an acceptable way to cope. And they don't think it's acceptable for victims who continue to engage with the offender. We all understand those dynamics when it happens in a domestic violence case. Many victims of stalking maintain contact with a stalker because they're negotiating for the safety. I keep my friends close and my enemies closer. The more I know, the better temperature check I can do on the offender's behavior. Maybe I call the offender and have a conversation, because then I know what kind of mood they're in. And if we have a victim who's making contact with the offender, doesn't mean we don't have a stalking case. People say to me all the time, well, victims who contact the offender can't be that scared. And usually it's just the opposite. Many victims who contact the offender are so scared, that's why they're maintaining contact with the offender. So keep in mind that many victims of stalking are negotiating for their safety, and that's why they're making contact with the offender. Doesn't mean you don't have a stalking case anymore. We also have to keep in mind that that safety planning changes a lot, and we are constantly reevaluating safety based on the offender's most recent tactics. So keep in mind, if you do a risk assessment like SHARP and you come up with a safety planning, that safety planning has to change. It's safety planning, not a safety plan. Okay, it has to be dynamic. It has to change according to what the offender's reaction is and what the victim feels like the next best step for their safety is. So keeping in mind that we have to constantly be reevaluating that. And all of the things that Emma has linked are available on our website. So please go to stalkingawareness.org, check out the additional materials that we're going to have. If we've convinced you that this is a conversation that you need to continue to have in your jurisdiction, reach out to us for additional training, reach out to us for technical assistance. You can reach out to me directly, or you can find all of our contact information on our website. I will let you know that email is the best way to get a hold of me, just because we travel quite frequently, or we're in a webinar like this. So if you called me right now, I wouldn't answer because I'm on with all of you. So check out the website, and please reach out to us if there's anything that we can do to improve your coordinated response to stalking. But I want to thank all of you for spending 90 minutes with us, for the excellent work that you are doing to increase victim safety and hold offenders accountable. And if there's anything that Spark can do on behalf of the Office on Violence Against Women, who provides us funding, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. And please reach out to us if there's anything that we can do to improve your response. So have a great afternoon, everyone. Thank you.